A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. Juliet Smith from our sister station in Eugene spoke with one of the professors to learn more.
For most of the 20th century, American archaeology told one story about how this continent was first settled, and it told it with total confidence. Roughly 13,000 years ago, a group of hunters known as the Clovis people crossed a strip of exposed land connecting Siberia to Alaska, slipped through a corridor between two retreating ice sheets, and became the first human beings to ever set foot in the Americas. Their signature weapon, a fluted stone spear point found near Clovis, New Mexico, became the marker of that arrival. Textbooks printed it as fact. Museums built entire halls around it. Generations of students learned it as settled science, the same way they learned the water cycle or the phases of the moon. Then archaeologists in Oregon started digging in the wrong places, and the story stopped holding together. This is not a tale about one lucky shovel strike or one headline-grabbing bone. It is about two sites less than 100 miles apart in the high desert of southern and central Oregon, each investigated slowly and carefully over years, each independently producing evidence that human beings were standing on American soil long before the Clovis timeline allowed. And once those two sites forced the field to take pre-Clovis dates seriously, evidence that had been dismissed or ignored for decades elsewhere in the country suddenly looked very different. In the high desert of south-central Oregon, near the small town of Paisley, there is a series of shallow rock shelters carved into an old lakeshore bluff. Archaeologists had known about the Paisley Caves for most of the 20th century. Early excavations in the 1930s turned up animal bones and a scattering of stone tools, but the site never became a priority. It sat quietly, catalogued but unexamined, while the profession's attention stayed fixed on Clovis-era sites elsewhere. That changed when University of Oregon archaeologist Dennis Jenkins led a renewed excavation of the caves beginning in the early 2000s. Rather than searching for spear points, Jenkins and his team focused on something far less glamorous: coprolites, which is the scientific term for preserved ancient feces. In the arid conditions of the Oregon desert, human waste can survive for thousands of years, desiccated and hardened, holding on to organic material that would rot away almost anywhere else. It is not the kind of find that photographs well for a magazine cover, but it turned out to be one of the most information-dense archaeological materials imaginable. The team recovered dozens of coprolites from deep, undisturbed layers of the cave floor. When they were sent for radiocarbon dating, several came back with ages older than 14,000 years, and some approached 14,300 years before present. That alone would have been a striking claim, so the team did something the field expects of extraordinary claims. They tested and retested. Multiple laboratories dated multiple samples using different equipment, and the results kept landing in the same range, consistently placing human activity at Paisley Caves at least 1,000 years before the earliest confirmed Clovis sites. Age alone invites skepticism, because sediment can shift, samples can become contaminated, and older material can settle into younger layers over time. Critics of the Paisley findings raised exactly these objections when the results were first published in 2008. But the coprolites carried something that silenced most of that doubt: DNA. Genetic analysis extracted mitochondrial sequences that matched haplogroups A2 and B2, lineages strongly associated with Native American populations and, more broadly, with populations originating in Siberia and East Asia. This was not ambiguous animal waste that might have been misidentified. It was human, and it belonged to ancestral lineages still present in indigenous communities today. That detail matters more than it might first appear. It means the people who sheltered in that cave over 14,000 years ago were not some failed, dead-end migration that vanished without descendants. Their genetic line continued. It survived the end of the Ice Age, survived thousands of years of climatic upheaval, and persists in living populations right now. The oldest confirmed human presence in the region turned out to be connected by blood to people alive today, not a curious footnote in a display case. Jenkins published his findings in the journal Science, and the reaction from the archaeological community was sharply divided. Some researchers accepted the dating outright. Others argued that the coprolites might have been contaminated by later human activity soaking down through porous cave sediment, since urine and moisture can, in theory, migrate through soil layers over time. The debate continued for years, with follow-up studies attempting to address the contamination question through more precise stratigraphic control and additional dating of associated artifacts. Paisley Caves became one of the most scrutinized pre-Clovis sites in North America, and while pockets of doubt remain, The accumulated evidence pushed a meaningful share of the field toward accepting that people were in Oregon well before the traditional Clovis first model allowed. One site producing an early date can always be treated as an anomaly, a single result waiting for a more mundane explanation. It takes a second, independent site with a completely different kind of evidence to turn an anomaly into a pattern. Oregon had one waiting less than 100 miles away. Southwest of Paisley, in Harney County near the small town of Riley, sits a modest rock overhang known as Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. University of Oregon archaeologist Patrick O'Grady began excavating there in 2011, and unlike the coprolite discovery at Paisley, the story of Rimrock Draw is one of patient, incremental work rather than a single dramatic find. 4 years, the site yielded only scattered obsidian flakes and a groundstone tool, unremarkable by themselves, the kind of material that keeps a dig funded but rarely makes headlines. What makes Rimrock Draw scientifically powerful is not any single artifact, but a layer of volcanic ash buried in the site's stratigraphy. Geologists were able to match this ash to a known eruption, and volcanic ash layers function almost like a geological signature. An eruption event scatters a distinct chemical and mineral fingerprint across the landscape in a single moment in time, and that layer can be matched to eruptions with securely known dates. Once identified, an ash layer becomes an uncompromising boundary in the dirt. Whatever lies beneath it predates the eruption. There is no plausible way for younger material to have burrowed its way underneath a sealed ash deposit. This sidesteps the exact contamination argument that dogged the Paisley coprolites, because there is no reasonable mechanism by which artifacts could migrate downward through a hardened volcanic ash cap. Beneath that ash layer, O'Grady's team recovered 27 fragments of tooth enamel belonging to Ice Age megafauna, including species related to ancient camels and an extinct large-bodied bison distinct from the modern American buffalo. These were animals that had not walked the Oregon landscape for many thousands of years. Radiocarbon dating placed the enamel fragments at roughly 18,000 years old, with some estimates extending further back. O'Grady has said publicly that he reran the dating more than once before he was willing to accept the numbers, precisely because claims of this age carry heavy professional risk in a field where premature announcements have ended careers. The truly striking find, however, sat about 10 centimeters below those animal teeth, meaning it was older still. It was a single-worked stone tool made of orange chalcedony, a glassy quartz material, shaped with multiple functional edges, a curved cutting edge, a flatter scraping edge, and a serrated edge worn smooth from repeated use. The wear pattern on that serrated edge is worth pausing on. That kind of polish does not appear after a few uses. It develops from years of handling, sharpening, and reuse, meaning this was not a discarded scrap but a tool someone relied on, carried, and maintained over a long period of their life before it was left behind in that shelter. Stylistically, the tool does not resemble a Clovis point at all. It belongs to what archaeologists call the Western stem tradition, characterized by long blades with rounded or tapering bases rather than the fluted, grooved base that defines Clovis points. Western stem tools have been found at other sites across the Great Basin and Pacific Northwest, and their technological lineage appears distinct from Clovis rather than derivative of it. Given that this particular tool was recovered from a layer older than material already dated to around 18,000 years, and given its position beneath a securely dated volcanic ash cap, Rimrock Draw offered something Paisley alone could not: a second, independently dated site suggesting human presence in Oregon that predates Clovis by a wide margin, associated with a tool-making tradition that looks nothing like the Clovis kit. Two sites, produced by two separate teams, using two different dating methods, converging on the same conclusion, is a very different thing than one contested result. It stops looking like an outlier and starts looking like a pattern the rest of the field has to explain. What makes the Oregon findings especially significant is that they were not actually the first challenge to the Clovis first model. Decades earlier, archaeologist James Adavajo had already found much of the same evidence at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in western Pennsylvania, a sandstone overhang along a tributary of the Ohio River. Beginning excavations there in the 1970s, Adavajo's team recovered radiocarbon dates suggesting human occupation stretching back 16 to 19,000 years, published in 1980. The response from much of the archaeological establishment was hostile. Some colleagues suggested contamination from coal deposits in the surrounding geology, which can skew radiocarbon results. Others simply declined to engage with the paper at all. Adavajo spent much of his career defending those dates against a field that, in some corners, seemed personally invested in the Clovis first model succeeding. Researchers eventually coined the term Clovis first syndrome, to describe the almost reflexive resistance to pre-Clovis claims, regardless of the evidence behind them. Even decades later, surveys of working archaeologists found only a minority fully accepted the Meadowcroft dates, with a large share remaining undecided or skeptical, not necessarily because the underlying science had been disproven, but because the implications were so disruptive to established careers, funded research programs, and museum narratives built around Clovis primacy. Oregon changed the calculus. A single contested site in Pennsylvania could be treated as an isolated anomaly for 40 years. Two geographically separate, methodologically distinct Oregon sites converging on the same pre-Clovis conclusion made that dismissal much harder to sustain. Atavajo, by many accounts, had simply been early. Once Oregon forced a more serious reconsideration of the pre-Clovis question, other long-debated sites started to look less like outliers and more like pieces of a broader pattern. At White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, researchers identified dozens of fossilized human footprints preserved in the dried bed of an ancient lake, first noticed in 2009 and studied intensively in the years since. The footprints include those of children and adults, some walking, some apparently moving quickly, alongside tracks left by Ice Age megafauna such as mammoths and giant ground sloths. Dating the footprints proved contentious. Initial radiocarbon dates from seeds embedded in the same sediment layers, published in 2021, suggested an age between roughly 21,000 and 23,000 years, but critics pointed out that the aquatic plant used for dating could have absorbed old carbon from groundwater, artificially inflating its apparent age. Researchers followed up with dating from conifer pollen, which does not carry that same groundwater contamination risk, and later with organic material from lake sediments analyzed in a study published in 2025. All three independent lines of dating converged on the same broad window, placing people at White Sands during the height of the last ice age, well before the opening of any ice-free corridor through which Clovis migrants supposedly traveled. Further west and further back in time, a 2017 study published in Nature examined mastodon bones and stone cobbles uncovered decades earlier during highway construction in San Diego County, California, known as the Cheruti Mastodon Site. The bones showed spiral fracture patterns consistent with being broken while still fresh, and the associated stones showed where patterns consistent with use as hammerstones and anvils. Uranium-thorium dating placed the site at an almost unbelievable 130,000 years old, a figure so far outside the accepted timeline that it implied some hominin species, not necessarily modern Homo sapiens, was active in North America over 100,000 years before any other confirmed evidence. The claim remains deeply controversial, and much of the field has been reluctant to fully engage with it, precisely because its implications are so disruptive. But it illustrates how far the boundaries of the debate have shifted once Oregon made pre-Clovis evidence harder to dismiss outright. Taken together, these sites also revived a question about how the first Americans actually arrived. The old model relied entirely on a single land route through an ice-free corridor. But the tool traditions found in Oregon do not match the toolkit associated with that route, and growing genetic and archaeological evidence points toward a second, earlier route along the Pacific coastline, likely involving small watercraft moving along the shore from East Asia through a chain of temporary coastal settlements. Comparable evidence for early seafaring capability comes from sites like those on Crete, where stone tools dated to well over 100,000 years old imply that even earlier hominins were capable of crossing open water, undermining the old assumption that ancient people simply could not have traveled by boat at all. None of this means archaeologists have settled on a new, tidy replacement story. If anything, the opposite is true. What Oregon did was force the field to stop treating the Clovis first model as a closed question and start treating it as one hypothesis among several, tested against evidence rather than defended out of institutional habit. The Paisley Caves coprolites gave researchers a genetically confirmed human presence over 14,000 years old, tied directly to ancestral lineages of indigenous peoples living today. Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter gave them a second site, dated by an uncompromising volcanic ash layer, pushing the timeline back even further and revealing a tool tradition unrelated to Clovis. Together, they gave long-dismissed evidence from Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and California a context in which it finally made sense rather than looking like a string of isolated errors. The story of the first Americans is no longer a single arrow drawn across a map, walking south from a frozen land bridge on one confident, well-funded timeline. It looks more like multiple waves of people, arriving by different routes, over a much longer span of time than anyone in the field was willing to admit for most of the 20th century. And it took two unglamorous excavations in the Oregon high desert, one built on preserved human waste, the other on a stubborn layer of volcanic ash, to make the rest of the evidence impossible to ignore. Somewhere in that same high desert, in ground nobody has excavated yet, there is likely more evidence waiting. The story of how and when people first reached the Americas is still being written, one careful layer of dirt at a time.